I'm going to pray and then we'll hear from God's word. So let's bow our heads and let's just fix our eyes on Jesus. This is a prayer by a poet, Ted Loder. O God, gather me now to be with you as you are with me. Soothe my tiredness, quiet my fretfulness, curb my aimlessness, relieve my compulsiveness. Let me be easy for a moment. O Lord, release us from the fears and guilts which grip us so tightly, from the expectations and opinions which we so tightly grip, that we may be open to receiving what you give, to risking something genuinely new, to learning something refreshingly different. O God, gather us to be with you as you are with us. Amen. So I'm going to be reading from Isaiah chapter 58, and if you've got a Bible with you, do join in. I'm going to be reading from this translation, which is the ESV. So in fact, no, I'm going to read from the one on the screen, otherwise it's going to be really confusing. I've been at home in that situation when people have read from other translations. Okay, here we go. Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of God. They ask for just decisions and they seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they said, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn them away from your own flesh and blood? Then will your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go out before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then will you call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, "Here I am." If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and the malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You'll be like well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Thanks be to God. There is something deep in us that wants the world to be fair. I know that my kids often appeal to Bethan and I with the total lack of justice and fairness in our home. I know it seems one of the first words that we learn. It isn't fair. It isn't fair. And I wonder if you've even thought this week at any point, this isn't fair. Why me? Even when we get caught in traffic, the smallest of things, there's something in us that yearns for justice, even on the maybe small moments. And as I've been thinking about this talk, I've walked past 3 people begging on the streets in the last couple of weeks. And I tell you what, it's a lot harder to walk past someone begging on the streets or outside Aldi when you're preparing a talk about mercy and justice and breaking the chains of oppression. And when I've spoken to a couple of these people, I've been struck by just how messy everything is, by how messy the world is, how injustice just seems to be baked into the system. And I feel like that in my job as well. I work as an assistant head in a local school, and so often when I sit in meetings with families which are broken and where things aren't working, I look at it and it's not just a lack of support from agencies, it's sometimes generational challenges, it's sometimes personal choices, it's a whole messy mix of things. And this passage from Isaiah 58 mentions some of those who have experienced this unfairness of injustice in the world, the hungry and those without shelter. But a short glance through the Bible reveals groups such as widows, orphans, refugees, immigrants, the blind, those with debilitating illnesses that mean they can't work or weren't accepted in society, the elderly, and in our day we could add others to that group. We could talk about asylum seekers, those on certain benefits, workers who were unfairly paid, and the list could go on. Even people who are caught up in systems that mean that they end up on the outside and they struggle to get in. And the truth is this, some people seem to have more hard luck than others. The world isn't fair. Some people are born into families, into systems, into situations where getting out is almost impossible. Some end up being crushed by the system while others benefit from it. And it seems to be deeper than just individual choices or poor political leadership. It does seem to be woven into our world in some way. Now, one of the remarkable things about the Bible and about the God of the Bible is this. He seems to have favorites. If you're familiar with the Bible and its stories, you will get the distinct impression that God is on the side of the poor. The Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez called this God's preferential option for the poor. God's preferential option for the poor. And God champions the poor. He fights the corner of the powerless. Psalm 146 talks about the Lord setting prisoners free, opening the eyes of the blind, lifting those who are bowed down, watching over the traveller, upholding the widow and the fatherless. Look through the prophets in the Old Testament and you will see how often God slams Israel for ignoring the poor. Even the social systems that God installs in the Old Testament seems to look after those in need. So when they're collecting manna in the desert after shortly leaving slavery in Egypt, when they find this food on the floor that provides for their needs, God acknowledges that some will collect some quicker than others. Some will collect little and others will collect more. Just, I guess they're better collectors. But God says you're allowed this much after collecting, and it's to be distributed fairly. If you look at God's laws in Exodus and in Leviticus, you'll find laws about gleaning, about harvesting, that the farmers were not allowed to harvest right to the edges of the fields, but leave margins so that the poor had food that they could get. And every seventh year, debts would be cancelled and slaves would be freed, getting rid of that baked-in injustice. And every seventh year, there would be land going back to the original owner of that land. These kind of like reset buttons that try to stop those things that we know all too well in our society. People who are crippled by debt, emotional debt, economic debt. And God is the God of the poor. You know, Jesus continues this trend in the New Testament as God incarnate here on earth. Jesus spends so much time with the poor. Many of his followers are from the fringes of society, mostly poor, although even his rich followers, like the tax collector Matthew, he wasn't poor, but he would have been deeply, deeply despised and outcast from his people. But the remarkable thing about the God of the Old Testament is not just that he's the God of the poor, but that he's not just on their side, but he identifies with them. He finds himself amongst them. And when he chooses to become a human, he chooses to find himself in the poor. He is born as a man in a feeding trough. His parents, when they go to the temple, have to buy pigeons, which was the sacrifice that the poorest of the poor would have bought. It's just worth bearing that in mind, that God could have chosen any time, any person, any people group. He chose a poor family from a group that is arguably one of the most oppressed groups in the whole of history. This was revolutionary in the day when gods were on the side of the elite, the gods were on the side of the rich and the powerful. This was a God who sided so much with the poor that in Matthew 28:25, when Jesus is talking about the end of time, he says that he will commend people for feeding the hungry and for clothing the naked and for giving to those in need. And when they said to him, and commending them, that they did that for him. And when they say, how do we do that? He says, whenever you did this for the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. Every single time we reach out to those in need, the vulnerable and the poor and those who are oppressed, we do it for Jesus, because he's not just on their side, but he identifies with them. We find him there. And so what we see in the Bible is a God whose character is to feel compassion for the poor, who advocates on their behalf to the rich and powerful when they are ignored, and even who identifies with them, who chooses to be born into a poor family and live his last few years homeless, dying the death of a criminal, and buried in a borrowed grave. It's obvious which side he's on. I wonder which side we feel the church is on. When we look at this passage in Isaiah 58, we see a people confused about why God isn't listening to them. They seek him daily. They do so many things that are right. They're doing their religious stuff. And I expect they were giving to the poor. They weren't just closed-minded to the poor. There would have been systems that they were following that supported the poor. But they are failing to do what Micah famously said God wanted, which was to love mercy, to do justice, and to walk humbly with God. You see that their law required certain things, which they almost certainly were doing, like giving 10th of their income to charity, to give away money to the poor. But verse 6 suggests that their action needs to go deeper. Just looking at the passage, verse 6 talks about not just giving, but loosing the bonds of wickedness, undoing the straps of the yoke. It sounds like kind of dismantling systems, dismantling things that were keeping the poor in their place. And God says to them that if they engage themselves in this work, then their light would break forth like the dawn. Their healing would spring up. He would hear them. There was something spiritually harmed in their community by their ignoring of this responsibility. And so now we get to us. We've seen what God is like and what Israel were like. And it's a trend that continued throughout the Bible. Let me ask you briefly, how do you feel you're getting on? Are you giving to those who are in need? Are we generous in responding to the powerless? I know during COVID, I feel like I have very little headspace to think about others who are having a hard time. I've often been consumed by my own life. And so the simple answer at this point would just be, I need to do more. I need to be more outward looking. And I could finish it there, and we could go away, and I don't think I've said anything that most of us don't already know this morning. We could just end it there. But I just want to warn you at this point of two dangers as we sit with these age-old truths that God is the God of the poor and we're not doing enough. Two dangers. The first is guilt and shame and this sense of we're not good enough, nor will we ever be good enough. None of us do enough for the poor, for those in need, for those who are vulnerable. And we might hear these words that God says and just be turned into shame and guilt and self-loathing. I'm not good enough. We might even become paralyzed by that. We might commit to going home and re-looking at our direct debits or looking at our church giving or thinking, could I add some hours of volunteering or maybe even just seeing the person next door that I know who's going through a hard time. I should be doing more, but I can't do more. I will do more. There's a real danger in church of overcommitting and offering cheap promises to God in these kind of moments because of what we hear from people like me standing at the front. We used to go to St. Thomas Crooks up at the top of the hill, and I lost count of how many times before we had kids I pledged to God that I would go to live in a council estate somewhere in Sheffield. I never did. But the number of times I ended up at the front on my knees, genuinely heartfelt pledges to God. I will do more. I will go there. I will be with those people. And I never did. I never did. I got caught up in that moment and I said to God, I will do more. I will be better. I promise. I can see that you are for the poor. I can see where I should be. And I didn't. So the first danger is that we become motivated by guilt and by shame and by needing to do better. The second danger is that we fall into moralism and self-righteousness. I think this is more what's going on in the Isaiah passage. We can look at ourselves and say, well, I think I'm doing pretty well at this already. I sponsor a child abroad. Maybe I volunteer for this charity. I give money. I've given sacrificially. I've given much of my life, maybe even, to doing this. And we see Jesus sometimes criticizing people who are doing an awful lot, but are wearing it as a badge of honor. And you might be sitting at home or here feeling pretty smug, like you've already done a lot of this. And of course you could do more, but maybe it's not a delight. Maybe it's not something you take joy in, but God has brought you a long way in serving the poor and the needy. And there's also a danger for the churches to become like this. That actually as churches we think, we've done this. We are fulfilling our obligations. And sometimes as churches we can even become places that basically we become extended churchy versions of social care or welfare, and we just become about serving the poor and serving the needy. And the world sees that, but they don't ever see God. So there are dangers in how we move forward from here. So, just coming into the final section, what is the response then? What do we do from here? Well, I think the response that Isaiah is trying to provoke here is not more charity or even guilt, but a turning back to God. I think what Isaiah is asking for firstly here is that Israel turn to God and then to the needy and the vulnerable. Let me just unpack that a little bit. In verse 3, he talks about the fact that in the day of their fast, they sought their own pleasure. A lot of the translations say that word pleasure can be referring to work. So they're still engaging in their work, their enterprises on the day of their fast. And they're not allowing their workers time off. In verse 13, Isaiah challenges them to turn back their foot. Again, don't work, taking the Sabbath and finding the Sabbath a delight. And what was the Sabbath for? The Sabbath was to take delight in the Lord. What Isaiah is calling Israel to is not firstly more care for those who are in need, but to God. God was the one that they'd forgotten. The issue, if we stake our hope in justice coming about through us, is that we will fail, or we will become proud. We'll either become like me, sitting at St. Thomas's on my knees, pledging to move to another council estate and never doing it, feeling bad, or we become smug and self-righteous and maybe even disdainful of those who aren't doing enough. And the other problem is that we don't actually want to share our goods. I don't, anyway. Now, I don't want to share my money. I don't want to host people in my home that are difficult. I don't want to have a less comfortable life. I quite like my life as it is. I don't want to have to take choices that make life harder at times for myself. I don't want to sit down and talk to someone outside Aldi who's having a rough time, because all these things come into my mind about, well, why are they here? And should I give them money? And if I do give them money, we'll make it worse. And maybe even I need to get home. I don't want to do a lot of this stuff. Just doing better will not work. Earlier I said that God has a preference for the poor. He identifies with the poor. And why does he do that? Because he is a God of compassion. He is a God of love and of compassion. And the same compassion that drove God to identify with the poor to such an extent that he became poor also drove him to stop identifying with the glory of heaven and identify with our humanity and be made sin for us. The same compassion that made God of heaven come down to earth and identify with the poor is the same compassion that drives him to identify with you in your failing, in your weakness, in our far less than perfect nature. What I need to do to make me more open to the needy and the vulnerable is I need to make my heart more open to him. No heart that is open to the love of God can be closed to the vulnerable and needy. If we want to have our hearts open to the needy, we need our hearts open to him. Just think about that for a moment. Where would we be without the love of Christ? Where would our hearts be without his grace? I did the Lent course, a couple of the Lent sessions during Lent that Will led, and there was someone who told me their testimony. I heard another testimony this last week about someone and their story of how God had lifted them from some really dark, difficult places. And just hearing the stories of God's love and his grace again and again was inspiring, and it warmed my heart and it melted my heart and it softened my heart and it opened my heart. And that is the place where I then look at the poor and needy and just want to give. If you meditate on his generosity to you, how much he has given to you, how he suffered for you, how much he gave for you, then your hand will go in your pocket without you even realizing. You will want to give. We will want to have our lives, not just our money, but our time. We will want that more. And there's a kind of delightful opposite of a vicious circle here. The more we open our hearts to God, I believe the more we want to spend time and give ourselves for the poor and needy. And the amazing thing is, because God identifies with the poor and needy, it's often in those places when we discover him more. And then we discover him more, which opens our hearts more. But it starts with him. It starts with opening our hearts back to him. As a response to this, we're going to listen to a song which is normally sung at Christmas, but I don't like the fact that at Christmas, so many of the best hymns are at Christmas, and I often get to the end of the Christmas season and think, we haven't done that one, and we haven't done that one, because you have to pack them into like 3 weeks, and we didn't get to sing, or I didn't hear this one last Christmas, and it's Thou who wast rich beyond all splendour, all full of sake became poor. It's an amazing, amazing hymn. And it says this, first 2 lines, Thou who wast rich, beyond all splendour, all for love's sake, not duty's sake, not self-interest's sake, all for love's sake became poor. That's what motivates us. It's love. That's the stuff that works. It goes on to say, thrones for a manger didst surrender, sapphire paved courts for stable floor. And the final verse, Thou who art love, beyond all telling, Saviour and King, we worship you. This last verse, when we hear it, that's where we start to become more open to the poor and needy. It says, Emmanuel, within us dwelling. When we allow him to dwell in us, our hearts become softer to the needs of the world. And it finally finishes with, make us what thou wouldst have us be. God, make us what you wouldst have us be. Lord, as we listen to this hymn now, this beautiful, beautiful hymn, help us to remember that you gave up everything for us. Help us to meditate on that, to think on it, to delight on it. And as we do, allow that truth, the truth of your love and your grace to work on our hearts to make us more like the people we were made to be. Thank you that this isn't about duty or self-interest or shame or guilt. This is about turning our eyes back to you and allowing you to just work in us. Let's listen to this hymn together.